I'm Amy Goodman. We end today's show with the 25th annual survey from the Committee to Protect Journalists of journalists killed and jailed around the world. This year, the list of those killed includes 46 journalists and media workers, some covering wars, others murdered in retaliation for their reporting, another 20 killed in circumstances CPJ cannot confirm or related to their work, a record 262 journalists imprisoned around the world, with Turkey, China, and Egypt topping the list for the second year in a row. Few, if any, of the murders are solved. This comes as President Trump has waged a relentless campaign to discredit journalists in the United States, often with rhetoric that could potentially incite his followers to violence. For more, we're joined by Maria Salazar-Ferro, who is the director of the Committee to Protect Journalists Emergencies Department. Maria, welcome to Democracy Now! Talk about what you found. And also, coming out of this interview around Emilio Gutierrez, the journalist imprisoned in a U.S. jail, can you talk about the dangers Mexican journalists face? Absolutely.
There was a record number of journalists imprisoned this year, 262, as you said, around the world. The top 3 jailers of journalists account for more than half of those journalists. And about 3/4 of journalists imprisoned around the world are behind bars on anti-state charges, such as terrorism. Interestingly, we noted this year that there was a spike in charges of false news in countries, again, in some of the top countries like Turkey, China, and Egypt.
In those 3 top countries, Egypt, China, Turkey, when you talk about, you're talking about fake news, this something that President Trump has been pushing around the United States, charging the media with putting it out.
Exactly. Last year we had documented 9 cases. This year we documented 21 around the world on this charge. And, you know, we're talking about authoritarian governments, but they are holding on to any kind of reason to imprison journalists, and this kind of rhetoric coming out of President Trump and can embolden them in terms of jailing journalists who are critical of their governments.
In May, award-winning Mexican reporter Javier Valdez was assassinated, dragged out of his car, shot 12 times, less than a block from his office. The killing of Valdez sparked widespread outrage across Mexico. Multiple Mexican digital media outlets went on a 24-hour strike, refusing to publish anything but a black banner with the names of the journalists assassinated in Mexico at the time. This is a clip of Valdez's 2011 speech when he came here to New York to receive the International Press Freedom Award from the Committee to Protect Journalists.
I have been a journalist these past 21 years, and never before have I suffered or enjoyed it this intensely, nor with so many dangers.
En Culiacán, Sinaloa, Mexico.
In Culiacán, in the state of Sinaloa, Mexico, it is dangerous to be alive, and to do journalism is to tread an invisible line drawn by the bad guys, who are in drug trafficking and in the government, in a field strewn with explosives. This is what most of the country is living through. One must protect oneself from everything and everyone, and there do not seem to be options or salvation, and often there is no one to turn to.
That's the award-winning Mexican reporter Javier Valdez. In May, he was gunned down. Maria.
This was a particularly brutal killing, and one that touched us personally. As you just saw, Javier was he received our award, but he was a personal friend of a lot of CPJ staff, and it was just heartbreaking. I had personally been in touch with him right before this happened. And I think Javier's case really shows the degree to which Mexican journalists are vulnerable. I mean, this guy was a renowned investigative journalist, and he really thought that his work and his position kind of protected him, but it didn't. His reporting put him in more danger, and there was not enough done to protect him. He was one of 6 journalists we documented having been targeted in Mexico this year. Mexico is interesting because we noted a decrease in the targeting of journalists, the direct targeting of journalists in retaliation for their work this year. But around the world, we saw a decrease, not so in Mexico. In Mexico, it continued to happen.
Burma. 2 Reuters reporters just detained who could face up to 14 years in prison for allegedly violating the country's Official Secrets Act?
That's right. That's a colonial law that is still in the books. They were reporting on the Rohingya crisis and are being accused of having illegally obtained information from police. They face up to 14 years in prison, and like most of what we're seeing around the world, they're being punished and silenced for reporting on something critical.
What about the impunity governments feel? What happens to governments where journalists are killed? What do governments do in Turkey, in China? I mean, these are the governments that are imprisoning them.
Right. So there's China, Turkey, Egypt that are imprisoning journalists, but there's also, that's one problem. Then there's a second really large problem around the world in terms of being able to do your work as a journalist, and that's impunity in killings of journalists. That's a problem that we've seen in Mexico continue throughout the last decade. When a government does not punish, does not go after the killers of journalists, it just emboldens more attacks and more killings of journalists.
What are you calling for at CPJ?
In terms of impunity, we're calling the international community to shed a light on this, and we're calling on governments like the government of Mexico to investigate and punish those who are killing journalists.
And overall, these 2 reports, one on arrests, one on killings, what do you overall hope to accomplish?
We really think that the international community and international pressure is one of the best weapons we have to protect journalists. We are calling on the international community to pressure governments like the Turkish government, like the Chinese government, to release journalists, and to call on Mexican authorities to investigate and protect journalists who are doing their job.
I want to thank you so much for being with us, Maria Salazar-Ferro, Director of the Committee to Protect Journalists Emergencies Department. And that does it for our show, Democracy Now! Now accepting applications for our paid year-long news fellowship. Details at democracynow.org. Democracy Now! Produced by Renee Feldstein, Guzder, Nermeen Sheikh, Carla Wills, Laura Gottesdiener, Sam Alcoff, John Hamilton. Thanks so much for joining us. I'm Amy Goodman. Have a happy new year and good news next year.